So just so people know, the reason that we're speaking into microphones and that is for the recording. We're not actually
not actually being amplified.
Amplified,
right?
That's right. So please welcome Adrian Moore.
Thank you very much. Okay. All right, so I'm Adrian Moore, Vice President of the Reason Foundation. I just want to finish kind of rounding out the overview. So the Reason Foundation, we're a nonprofit think tank. We work on a lot of government reform issues. Our pension reform project is really kind of hinges around two things. One is we've been doing a lot of research on what's happened in pension reform over the last couple of decades. So doing detailed case studies of a lot of the state and local governments that have done pension reform and what the lessons learned are, because in every one, when you talk to the officials that were involved, there are things they would maybe do different if they could go back in time. And so we want to capture all of that so that subsequent states that are and local governments that are doing reform can learn from those lessons. And at the same time, what we've done is we've sort of corralled a bunch of former officials from cities, counties, and states, from former legislators, folks that worked in governor's offices, city councilmen, budget officers, county supervisors who did pension reform and are still around either in office or back in the private sector and are willing to help other places who are looking at doing pension reform, kind of be peer coaches or whatever, just share their experiences and help jurisdictions figure out how to solve some of the problems they might have with doing pension reform based on their experience. And so we're actually going to have Dan Lillienquist, former state senator from Utah, who ran the Utah pension reform effort 3 years ago now? 3 years ago now, yeah. He'll be here later today to kind of tell his story, and that's pretty much what he does now. Is he's almost full-time just helping other jurisdictions who are looking to do pension reform to figure out how to do it right, basically. And that's really the thickest thing you got in your packet is our pension reform handbook, which is a distillation of all of that experience. What we tried to do was put everything we could learn from all of these people and all of these places that did pension reform into one package as sort of like a game plan. Here are all the steps that you probably need to go through to do pension reform. Not all of those steps will apply in every place, but some of them will apply everywhere. And so that's really what that is to try to distill that learned experience and knowledge down into one package, at least as a starting point for folks. So, the point of today is kind of the same thing. We're going to try to briefly share with you what everybody else out there who's done pension reform has learned along the way, so you have some idea of what it has entailed and what it might entail if Wyoming was to embark upon, or cities in Wyoming were to embark upon doing some pension reform themselves. So we're going to talk about some general principles, case studies, and implementation practices that have been developed. I'm not even actually. We put this in the original slide deck, but I think Don, Representative Burkhart, covered this stuff pretty well. The basics of the Wisconsin system. There's the list of 9 that you were talking about. But just for crucial general context, this is a phenomenon that's going on all over the place, which is why you hear so much about pension reform. It's not an isolated situation. It's something you could see coming along over a decade ago, and now you've got places all over the country wrestling with these problems or ignoring these problems in some cases, and a lot of places that have done reforms just in the last couple of years. And there's common problems underlying this. The briefs you've got from the Wyoming, the 2 briefs that are specifically about Wyoming, have some details about this element in Wyoming, the rising costs. But you can see when the percentage of payroll that is going to pensions, which is what this graph shows. That was the wrong button to hit. There we go. What this graph shows, you see, you're talking about an almost tripling of the share, and that's totaling up across the United States. So that number is actually brought down by all the pension plans out there that, for various reasons, aren't in trouble. You've got places like San Diego, which did its reforms about 5 years ago, where the percentage of payroll that was going to pensions got over 50%. And when more than 50% of your payroll is going to pensions, you literally cannot hire anybody. There's just that you're barely making payroll at that point, and it causes some pretty catastrophic problems. There's a big crowding out that goes on here when your payroll, when you're paying, go from 8% of your budget going into, or 8% of your payroll going into pensions to 20, 30, 40%, paving streets, garbage collection, running the prisons, paying for schools, gets crowded out, pure and simple. One of the ways that crowding out gets dealt with in a lot of places is simply not making adequate payments into the system, either by simply not meeting ARC payments, or by assuming very high rates of returns, like Representative Burghardt talked about, and upon failure to achieve those returns, running up unfunded liabilities. Now, the most conservative estimate of the unfunded liabilities out there puts them about $1 trillion, and that's assuming that the market is going to do incredible and that we're actually going to see those 7.5% returns across the board without fail over the next 30 years. If that doesn't happen, those unfunded liabilities start to climb, and if you assume something more reasonable, like the market's going to average maybe 5 or 6% over the next 30 years, you get up to around $4 trillion in unfunded liabilities. That's a lot of money for state and local governments to have to scrape up. This just shows, I don't have a pointer, but the darker the states, the darker the state is, the higher a percentage of the money they need to meet their pension obligations that they have in their accounts. So this is the funding ratios for various states, assuming a fairly pessimistic view of the next 30 years of the stock market. Okay, so if you assume market returns much more like 5%, the funding ratios of states are really pretty lousy. The interesting thing about pension reform to me, in a lot of ways, is how the politics is played out. I'm not much of a political guy, but my priors going into this were that the distribution of support and opposition would be much more diverse around the country. But we've been looking at polls run by local news outlets all the way up to universities across the country, and pension reform is overwhelmingly popular. There's really only one sector one demographic that consistently opposes pension reform, and that are households that have a public sector union worker in them. Are the only consistent demographic. Left, right, blue state, red state, doesn't matter. It's over 50% in every other demographic. And even there, it's 65%. So 35% of households that have a public sector union worker support pension reform. And what seems to be going on there is those tend to be somewhat younger workers who are worried that the current system might not be sustainable and they might wind up not getting their promised benefits. Sort of the Social Security effect that they see at work. This is, boy, we've got to update this at some point. There's been a couple of other ballot initiatives on pension reform besides these, but you can see that where it has been put on the ballot, with only one exception, it is passed, and is passed pretty overwhelmingly everywhere it's been put up. So pension reform is a pretty popular idea in general. The details obviously matter a lot, and that's where most of the controversy tends to get around. And a lot of what we're going to talk about later today is about the kinds of reforms you do, how do you structure the reforms so that you create sustainability but also create sound retirement benefits and solve the potential concerns that a lot of people have once you start talking about the details. I'm not going to get into that, but let me just add as a last thing, we talk in the handbook at some length about, for want of a better word, some sort of principles of pension reform. And I'm going to circle back to these later when we start talking about actually putting a kind of a reform plan together. But that is really crucial, because I've seen pension reform discussions sort of start off on the wrong foot. If you're in a crisis mode, which a lot of places have been in, and San Diego is a great example, where they were literally on the verge of bankruptcy. They legitimately, on paper, they could totally have done a Detroit. They were upside down, and they've managed to stave that off with a lot of really dramatic reforms. They're still by no means in good financial shape, but they were in a crisis mode, and they did a lot of changes to the existing system and to future workers, and it took years to roll all of those changes out. And that's one situation. What Dan's going to describe that happened in Utah is sort of the other end of the spectrum, where they had a blip. Well, blip's not a good word. They had the recession and the market crash that came with it had a pretty significant effect on their system. They were in very good shape. They had been in good shape up to that point. It was just that one bad event made them realize that their system was vulnerable to that. That any time you had a bad market event, you could dramatically shift risks onto the taxpayers. And it was built into the system. And so he said, why don't we devise a system where it manages those risks instead of builds those risks in? So when you think about the principles of pension reform, you want something that sort of encompasses both of those pretty far apart situations. You still have to provide a good, secure retirement for all of your workers, because that's sort of the basic retirement benefit that workers are looking for. But you want it to be financially sustainable. You want it to have incentives that, going into the future, when some other group of people are legislators and not you, or some other group of people are city council members and not you, where the system is designed to incentivize everyone to make the right decisions about both financial sustainability, not running up debt, and not short shrifting workers in their retirement when they're the most vulnerable, when that's the income that they're depending on, right? And what we can see from the current system, and it's going to play out as we go along, is the current system doesn't do that. The current system, the reason we have trillions in unfunded liabilities is because there's huge incentives to do that right now. That's the way the budget process works. Every year you have to fight the temptation to run up the debt, to make the full payment, to make reasonable assumptions about when people are going to retire, to make reasonable assumptions about how much money you're going to make in the market. It's always much easier to be a little bit rosy in your scenario, and the consequence is we have this ratchet of debt. So the current system doesn't provide the security, doesn't provide the financial sustainability, and doesn't provide the right incentives. So it's really about thinking about what is a system that does align secure retirement, good incentives, and financial sustainability. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Lance to talk about some of the process of reform.